The Kentucky sun rose red over the cotton fields of the Whitmore plantation, staining the sky the color of blood that would be spilled that day. Judith walked between the rows of plants, her bare feet sinking into the damp earth, while the morning dew soaked the coarse fabric of her torn dress. At 23 years old, she carried on her back the scars of a lifetime of servitude, but in her eyes still burned a flame that not even the most brutal whippings could extinguish. The sound of the whip cutting through the air echoed across the fields, followed by a cry of pain that made Judith shudder. She knew that sound better than any lullaby. It was the daily music of the plantation, orchestrated by overseer Marcus Thornfield, a man whose cruelty was legendary, even by the brutal standards of the slave-holding South. "Judith, come here now!" Thornfield's harsh voice cut through the morning air like a blade. She raised her eyes and saw him standing near the stables, holding the whip still stained with blood. Beside him, Samuel, a 50-year-old black man who worked as a blacksmith on the plantation, was kneeling in the dirt, his back opened in wounds that bled through his shredded shirt. Judith walked slowly toward the overseer, each step weighing like lead. She knew that any hesitation would be interpreted as defiance, and defiance meant pain. Thornfield was a tall, thin man with greasy hair that stuck to his sweaty scalp and small, cruel eyes that seemed to find pleasure in others' misery. His hands, always dirty with earth and blood, held the whip with the familiarity of someone who used it as an extension of his own arm. "This useless Negro broke one of Master Whitmore's horseshoes," said Thornfield, spitting on the ground near Samuel's face. "You're going to clean up this mess and then go to the kitchen to prepare lunch. And if I hear any complaints about the food being late, you'll meet the same fate as him." Judith nodded silently, bending down to help Samuel stand. The older man trembled when she touched his arm, and she could feel the heat of fever already taking hold of his body due to the infected wounds. In Samuel's eyes, she saw the same look she had seen in so many others, the resignation of someone who had lost all hope that things could be different. "Thank you, child," Samuel whispered, his voice hoarse from screaming. "But don't get yourself in trouble for my sake. That man, he has no soul." Judith helped Samuel walk to the slave quarters, a row of rotting wooden cabins that barely offered protection against wind and rain. The smell of mold and disease permeated the air, mixed with the odor of bodies that rarely had the opportunity to wash properly. She left Samuel in the care of Martha, an elderly woman who served as an informal healer among the slaves, using herbs and prayers to try to alleviate the suffering that white medicine refused to treat. "He's getting worse every day," Martha murmured, examining Samuel's wounds with experienced hands. "Thornfield is killing our people slowly, and Master Whitmore pretends he doesn't see anything." Judith knew Martha was right. In recent months, 3 slaves had died due to injuries caused by Thornfield's punishments, and many others were so debilitated they could barely work. The overseer seemed to find pleasure not only in violence, but in the systematic degradation of any vestige of human dignity that the slaves tried to maintain. As she left Samuel's cabin, Judith was intercepted by Thornfield, who had appeared silently, like a sinister shadow. He positioned himself very close to her, so close that she could smell the sour scent of whiskey on his breath and see the sweat stains that darkened his dirty shirt. "You have beautiful eyes, Judith," he said, his voice low and threatening. "It would be a shame if something happened to them." He ran a dirty finger across her face, tracing a line from forehead to chin. "You understand what I'm saying, don't you?" Judith forced herself to remain still, though every fiber of her being screamed for her to pull away. She had learned, through years of suffering, that reacting to Thornfield's provocation only resulted in more pain, not just for her, but for anyone he decided to use as an example. "Yes, sir," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "Good girl." Thornfield smiled, revealing yellowed and rotten teeth. "Now go to the kitchen. Master Whitmore is expecting visitors for lunch, and if the food isn't perfect..." He left the threat hanging in the air, swinging the whip suggestively. Judith walked toward the big house, a two-story mansion with white columns that rose like a monument to wealth built on human suffering. The kitchen was located in a separate building behind the house, connected by a covered walkway that allowed house slaves to carry food without being seen by the Whitmore family's guests. The kitchen was a hot and stuffy environment, dominated by a large iron stove that radiated heat even on the hottest Kentucky summer days. Cast iron pots hung from hooks on the ceiling, and rustic wooden shelves displayed the basic utensils needed to prepare the elaborate meals the Whitmore family expected 3 times a day. Judith began preparing lunch, her hands working automatically while her mind wandered. She cut vegetables with mechanical precision, seasoned the meat with spices that Master Whitmore had imported from New Orleans, and put water to boil in a large iron pot. Working in the kitchen was one of the few moments when she could find some peace, away from Thornfield's watchful eyes and the constant threat of violence that hung over the fields. But even in the relative safety of the kitchen, Judith couldn't forget the look in Samuel's eyes when she had helped him. It was the same look she had seen on her mother's face before she died, 3 years ago, after a particularly brutal beating for trying to protect Judith from Thornfield. It was the look of someone who had lost all hope, who had accepted that death was the only possible liberation from a life of suffering. While stirring the stew that bubbled on the stove, Judith allowed herself to imagine for a brief moment what it would be like to live free. She had heard whispered stories about slaves who had escaped to the north, about a secret network of people who helped fugitives find freedom. But Kentucky was far from the border with the Free States, and the punishments for escape attempts were so severe that few dared to try. The sound of heavy footsteps on the walkway brought her back to reality. Thornfield appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face red with anger, and his eyes shining with a malice that made Judith's stomach contract with fear. "Master Whitmore is furious," he said, entering the kitchen and closing the door behind him. "It seems Samuel died an hour ago. Now he's worried that the other slaves will think they can get sick to avoid work." Judith felt as if she had been punched in the stomach. Samuel was dead. The gentleman who had worked on the plantation for more than 20 years, who had taught her how to make small wooden toys when she was a child, who always had a kind word even on the most difficult days. He was gone. "You look upset," Thornfield observed, approaching her with a cruel smile. "Maybe you need a lesson about not getting too attached to other Negroes. They come and go, but you'll stay here forever." He reached out and grabbed Judith's arm with enough force to leave marks. She tried to pull away, but he pulled her closer, pressing her against the hot kitchen wall. "You know," he said, his voice low and threatening, "I've been thinking about you a lot lately. A young and beautiful woman like you shouldn't waste her life crying over dead Negroes. Maybe it's time you learned to be more grateful." Judith felt panic rise in her throat when she understood the implications of his words. She had seen other slave women taken by Thornfield, had heard their screams echoing through the night, had seen the empty look in their eyes in the days that followed. Now it was her turn. "Please, sir," she whispered, trying to pull away. "I need to finish lunch. The guests are waiting." Thornfield laughed, a harsh and unpleasant sound that echoed through the kitchen. "The guests can wait. This here is more important." He pressed her harder against the wall, and Judith could feel the heat from the stove radiating against her back. The smell of hot oil and cooking food mixed with the sour odor of Thornfield's sweat, creating a nauseating combination that made her stomach turn. It was then that she saw the pot of boiling oil on the stove, bubbling and crackling just a few meters away. For a moment, a clear image formed in her mind. She saw herself grabbing the pot and throwing the contents at Thornfield's face, saw him screaming and writhing in pain, saw herself running away from that cursed place. But the image disappeared as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the brutal reality of her situation. She was a slave, another man's property without rights or protection. Any act of resistance would be punished not only with her own death, but probably with the death of other slaves, as an example. Then Thornfield did something that changed everything. He mentioned her younger sister Rose, a girl of only 15 who worked in the big house. "Maybe," he said, his eyes gleaming with malice, "if you're not cooperative, I'll have to find other ways to amuse myself. Your little sister is getting quite grown up, don't you think?" Something broke inside Judith at that moment. The resignation that had been her constant companion for so many years disappeared, replaced by a cold and calculating rage she had never felt before. She looked into Thornfield's eyes and saw not only her own destruction, but the destruction of Rose, of Martha, of everyone she loved. "Did you understand what I said?" asked Thornfield, interpreting her silence as submission. "Yes," Judith replied, her voice strangely calm. "I understood perfectly." And in that moment, while the oil continued to boil on the stove and Thornfield smiled with cruel satisfaction, Judith made a decision that would change not only her life, but the fate of everyone on the Whitmore plantation. She had found her line in the sand, and Marcus Thornfield had just crossed it. The first chapter of Judith's story was coming to an end, but her true journey, a journey of resistance, revenge, and redemption, was just beginning. The oil in the cast iron pot bubbled violently, creating small explosions of hot grease that splattered the edges of the container. Judith could hear the hypnotic sound of the boiling liquid while Thornfield continued to press her against the kitchen wall, his rough hands exploring her body with the disgusting familiarity of someone who believed he had absolute right over her. "You're going to learn to obey me," he murmured in her ear, his hot and fetid breath making her shudder with disgust. "And then, when I'm done with you, maybe I'll visit your little sister. I'm sure she'll be much more receptive." The mention of Rose again was like lightning striking through Judith's mind. She closed her eyes and saw her younger sister's face, those large and innocent eyes that hadn't yet completely lost hope, the shy smile she offered when she thought no one was looking. Rose still believed that maybe, somehow, things could get better. Judith couldn't allow Thornfield to destroy that last spark of light in her family. "Are you listening to me?" Thornfield grabbed Judith's chin forcefully, forcing her to look into his eyes. "I asked if you're listening to me." "I'm listening," Judith replied, her voice surprisingly firm. Something had changed in her expression, a coldness that Thornfield couldn't fully interpret. "Excellent," he smiled, revealing his rotten teeth. "Now let's go to the barn. There we'll have more privacy." Thornfield began to drag her toward the door, but Judith resisted, planting her feet firmly on the kitchen's wooden floor. "Wait," she said, her mind working quickly. "The lunch. If I don't finish it, Master Whitmore will be furious. You said he's already irritated because of Samuel." Thornfield stopped, considering her words. Judith was right. Whitmore had made it clear that he expected lunch to be served punctually, especially with important guests coming from Louisville. The planter had a volatile temper, and his anger could easily turn against the overseer himself if things didn't go according to plan. "You have 5 minutes," Thornfield said, finally releasing her arm. "Finish that food quickly, and then we're going to have our conversation." Judith nodded, moving toward the stove with apparently submissive steps. Thornfield positioned himself near the door, blocking any possible escape route, his eyes fixed on her while she worked. He didn't realize he had made a fatal mistake. He had given Judith exactly what she needed, access to the stove and a few moments to act. With hands that trembled only slightly, Judith began stirring the stew cooking in a smaller pot. Beside it, the large pot of oil continued to boil, the golden liquid dancing in hypnotic waves. She could feel the heat radiating from the metal, could hear the constant sound of the oil in ebullition. "Hurry up," said Thornfield, impatient. "We don't have all day." "Almost finished," Judith replied, her voice calm, contrasting with the storm forming inside her. She picked up a wooden spoon and pretended to taste the stew, gaining a few precious seconds to calculate her next action. The oil pot was positioned so that she could reach it easily, but Thornfield was about 3 meters away, far enough that she would need absolute precision if she wanted her plan to work. She would have only one chance. If she missed, if she hesitated for even a second, he would kill her. And then go after Rose. Judith closed her eyes for a moment and thought of her mother, who had died trying to protect her. She thought of Samuel, whose body was still warm in the slave quarters. She thought of all the women who had suffered at Thornfield's hands, of all the children who had grown up knowing only pain and humiliation. But mainly, she thought of Rose. Enough! Thornfield began moving toward her, his patience finally exhausted. You've had enough time. It was at that moment that Judith acted. With a fluid and determined movement, she turned and grabbed the handles of the boiling oil pot. The metal was so hot it burned her palms instantly, but she ignored the pain, focusing all her energy on what she needed to do. Thornfield, perceiving the sudden movement, stopped abruptly, his eyes widening when he understood what was happening. "You wouldn't dare," he began, but his words were cut off when Judith raised the pot above her head. "This is for Samuel," she said, her voice loaded with a cold fury that had accumulated through years of suffering. "This is for my mother. This is for Rose. And this is for all of us." Thornfield tried to dodge, but he was too close and had reacted too late. Judith threw the pot's contents directly at his face and chest, the boiling oil meeting his skin with a terrible hissing sound. The scream that came from Thornfield's throat was something Judith would never forget. An animal, primitive sound that echoed through the kitchen and spread across the surrounding fields. He fell to the ground, his hands covering his face while he writhed in agony. The oil had hit mainly his eyes and the upper part of his face, the skin forming blisters instantly while the hot liquid continued to burn. "My eyes!" he screamed, his voice distorted by pain. "My eyes! I can't see!" Judith let the empty pot fall to the floor with a metallic crash, her burned hands trembling uncontrollably. She looked at Thornfield writhing on the ground and felt a complex mixture of satisfaction, horror, and terror for what she had just done. There was no going back. She had crossed a line from which she could never return. The smell of burned flesh began to fill the kitchen, mixing with the aroma of food still cooking on the stove. Thornfield continued to scream, his hands desperately trying to clean the oil from his face, but only spreading it more, causing even more damage. Judith knew she had only a few minutes before someone came to investigate the screams. She needed to think quickly, decide her next move. Fleeing was an option, but where to? As a black slave in Kentucky, she would be hunted like an animal. And even if she managed to escape, what would happen to Rose? To Martha, to all the others who would be left behind? Thornfield had stopped screaming, but still moaned softly, his hands covering his face while he tried to orient himself. Judith could see that the oil had caused devastating damage. His skin was red and swollen, with blisters forming rapidly. More importantly, his eyes were completely closed, swollen beyond recognition. You blinded me," he murmured, his voice hoarse and full of pain. "You blinded me, you bitch!" Even blind and injured, Thornfield still tried to intimidate her, still tried to exercise his power over her. But Judith no longer felt fear. What she had done was irreversible, and she had found a strength within herself that she didn't know existed. "Yes," she said simply, "I blinded you. And if you touch my sister or anyone else on this plantation, I'll do worse." Thornfield tried to get up, but was disoriented and in shock. He stumbled and fell again, his hands trying to find something to lean on. Judith watched him for a moment, feeling a dark satisfaction at seeing the man who had terrorized so many people reduced to a pathetic and helpless figure. But her satisfaction was interrupted by the sound of footsteps running toward the kitchen. Voices shouted from outside, and she knew her action had been discovered. In a few seconds, the kitchen would be full of people, and she would have to face the consequences of what she had done. Judith looked one last time at Thornfield, who still moaned on the ground, and then positioned herself near the stove, her burned hands still trembling, but her posture erect and defiant. She had made her decision, had made her choice. Now she would have to live or die, with the consequences. The kitchen door opened violently, and several people rushed in. Other slaves, overseers, and finally Master Whitmore himself, a corpulent middle-aged man with graying hair and eyes cold as ice. Everyone stopped abruptly when they saw the scene. Thornfield on the ground, moaning and holding his face, and Judith standing near the stove, the empty pot at her feet. "What the hell happened here?" roared Whitmore, his eyes moving quickly between Judith and Thornfield. Judith raised her chin and looked directly into Whitmore's eyes. She knew she was about to sign her own death sentence, but she didn't care anymore. She had found her voice, had found her strength, and wouldn't allow anyone to silence her again. "I defended my honor," she said, her voice clear and firm, echoing through the silent kitchen, "and I'll defend it again if necessary." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Thornfield's continued moans. Everyone in the kitchen knew they had just witnessed something that would forever change the dynamics of the Whitmore plantation. Judith had transformed from victim to symbol of resistance, and there was no going back. The silence in the kitchen was so dense, it seemed to have weight. Master Whitmore looked alternately at Thornfield, who continued moaning on the ground with his hands covering his disfigured face, and at Judith, who remained erect near the stove, her burned hands trembling slightly, but her gaze firm and defiant. "Someone get Dr. Morrison immediately!" Whitmore finally shouted, breaking the trance that had taken hold of everyone present. "And you!" He pointed to two overseers who had rushed in. "Take Thornfield to the big house. Be careful with his eyes." While the men moved to help the injured overseer, Whitmore approached Judith with slow and deliberate steps. She could see the fury growing in his eyes, but also something more, a kind of shock, as if he couldn't quite believe what had happened on his own property. "You," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "do you know what you just did?" "I know exactly what I did," Judith replied, surprising herself with the firmness of her own voice. "I defended my dignity and my sister's." Whitmore slapped her so hard that she staggered backward, hitting against the hot stove. Pain radiated through her face, but she didn't lower her eyes, didn't show submission. This only enraged Whitmore even more. "Dignity!" he spat. "You are my property. You have no dignity. You have no rights. You are an animal, and animals that attack their owners are put down." "Then put me down," said Judith, wiping the blood trickling from the corner of her mouth. "But know that others will see what happened here today. They'll know it's possible to fight." Whitmore raised his hand to hit her again, but was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Morrison, a thin and nervous man who served as physician for the region. Morrison quickly looked at the scene and ran to where Thornfield was being carried by the overseers. "My God," the doctor murmured upon examining the injuries. His eyes, the oil caused severe damage. "I need to take him to my office immediately." "Will he be all right?" asked Whitmore, his concern more related to losing an efficient employee than to Thornfield's well-being. Morrison shook his head gravely. "It's hard to say. The damage is extensive. Even if he survives, I doubt he'll recover his sight. Hot oil. It's one of the worst burns I've ever seen." "Dahi." While Thornfield was carried out of the kitchen, his moans echoing through the corridors of the big house, Whitmore turned again to Judith. His expression had become even darker with the confirmation that his overseer was permanently incapacitated. "You destroyed a man," he said, his voice loaded with cold anger. "A white man. Do you know what the punishment for that is?" "Death," Judith replied simply. "But at least I'll die knowing he'll never hurt anyone again." Whitmore studied her face for a long moment, looking for signs of fear or regret. When he found neither, his expression became even more dangerous. "Death would be too easy for you. he said finally. Too quick. No, I have something much worse in mind. He turned to the overseers who had remained in the kitchen. Lock her in the barn, chain her well. Tomorrow morning we're going to make an example that all the Negroes on this plantation will never forget. Oi! When the overseers approached her, Judith didn't resist. She knew that fighting would only result in more violence, and she needed to conserve her strength for what was to come. She allowed them to take her out of the kitchen, through the fields where other slaves worked, their heads down, but their eyes following every movement. The barn was located in the most distant part of the property, a large and dark structure that normally housed agricultural equipment and hay. But Judith knew it also served another purpose. It was where Whitmore took slaves for particularly severe punishments, away from the eyes of visitors or authorities who might question his methods. The overseers pushed her inside the barn and chained her to a thick wooden beam in the center of the structure. The chains were heavy and cold against her skin, and she could feel the metal cutting into her wrists when she tried to move. The smell of moldy hay and animal manure permeated the air, mixed with something more sinister, the residual odor of fear and suffering from others who had been brought there before her. "Enjoy your last night," said one of the overseers, a fat man named Jenkins, who had always shown particular pleasure in cruelty. "Tomorrow you're going to wish you'd never been born." After the men left, locking the heavy barn door behind them, Judith was alone in the darkness. The only light came from small cracks between the wooden boards, creating ghostly patterns on the dirt floor. She tried to make herself as comfortable as possible, but the chains severely limited her movements. As night fell over the plantation, Judith heard familiar sounds filtering through the barn walls, low voices of slaves returning from the fields, the crying of hungry children, the distant sound of music coming from the quarters. It was the soundtrack of her life, the sounds of a people who had learned to find moments of joy, even in the most desperate circumstances. But there was something different that night. The voices seemed more urgent, more animated. Judith could hear fragments of conversations being carried by the night wind, and gradually began to understand that her action had caused a much greater impact than she had imagined. She really did it. Blinded the overseer with hot oil. Never thought I'd see the day. Maybe things can change. Around midnight, Judith heard cautious footsteps approaching the barn. She tensed, preparing for another confrontation, but then heard a familiar voice whispering her name. "Judith? Are you there?" It was Martha, the elderly healer who had cared for Samuel. Judith could see her silhouette through a crack in the wall, moving carefully to avoid the guards that Whitmore had posted around the property. "Martha," Judith whispered back. "You shouldn't be here. It's too dangerous." "Child," said Martha, her voice loaded with emotion, "you did something none of us had the courage to do. You faced the devil and defeated him." "I only blinded him," Judith replied bitterly, "and now I'm going to die for it." "Maybe," said Martha, "but your death won't be in vain. You showed all of us that they're not invincible, that we can fight." Martha passed something through the crack in the wall, a small bottle containing a dark liquid. "It's laudanum," she explained. "If the pain becomes unbearable tomorrow, well, you understand." Judith took the bottle with trembling hands, understanding perfectly what Martha was offering. It was an exit, a way to escape the torture that Whitmore had certainly planned for her. "And Rose?" asked Judith. "Is she safe?" "For now," Martha replied. "But Whitmore is furious. He blames the whole family for your rebellion. You need to know. He's planning to sell her." Judith's heart sank. Being sold meant being separated forever from Rose, meant that her sister would be sent to another plantation where Judith couldn't protect her. Worse still, it meant that her sacrifice would have been in vain. "No," she whispered. "He can't do that." "He can and will," said Martha sadly. Unless what?" Martha hesitated for a moment before answering. "There are rumors, Judith. Rumors about people who help slaves escape. A secret network that extends to the free states. Some of the younger men are talking about trying to find this network. The Underground Railroad, Judith murmured. She had heard whispers about it before, stories that seemed too good to be true about slaves who had found freedom in the North. Yes, Martha confirmed, and your action today, it inspired others. They're beginning to believe that freedom is possible. Judith closed her eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Her impulsive action had unleashed something much bigger than she had imagined. It was no longer just about her or even about Rose. It was about all the slaves on the Whitmore plantation, about the possibility of real change. "Martha," she said finally, "if something happens to me tomorrow, promise you'll take care of Rose. Promise you'll help her find freedom." "I promise," Martha replied, her voice choked. "But don't give up yet, child. Sometimes, when everything seems lost, that's when miracles happen." After Martha left, Judith was alone again with her thoughts. She looked at the small bottle in her hands, knowing it represented both an exit and a responsibility. If she used the laudanum, she would escape the pain, but she would also abandon Rose and everyone else who now looked to her as a symbol of resistance. As the night progressed, Judith made a decision. She hid the bottle in a fold of her dress and prepared to face whatever Whitmore had planned for her. She wouldn't use the easy way out. If she was going to die, she would die standing, showing everyone that it was possible to face oppression with dignity. But deep in her heart, a small flame of hope still burned. Martha had spoken about the Underground Railroad, about the possibility of freedom. Maybe, just maybe, her action had planted seeds that would grow far beyond her own life. As dawn approached, bringing with it the day of her judgment, Judith prepared for the final battle. She had found her strength, had found her voice. Now it was time to discover if it would be enough to change not only her own fate, but the fate of all those she loved. Dawn came with a dense fog that stretched across the cotton fields like a ghostly shroud. Judith had spent the night awake, the chains cutting into her wrists whenever she tried to find a more comfortable position. Her burned hands throbbed with constant pain, constantly reminding her of the moment when she had changed the course of her life forever. The sound of multiple footsteps approaching the barn alerted her that her time had come. The heavy door opened with a sinister creak, and morning light invaded the dark space, making Judith blink as her eyes adjusted. Master Whitmore entered first, followed by Jenkins and two other overseers she didn't recognize, hard men with faces marked by violence and eyes cold as stone. "I brought some friends from other plantations," said Whitmore, his voice loaded with cruel satisfaction. They wanted to see personally the negress who had the audacity to attack a white man. One of the visitors, a tall and thin man with a scar that cut across his face from forehead to chin, approached Judith and studied her as if she were an exotic animal on display. "She doesn't look very dangerous," he commented, his voice with the typical drawl of the Deep South. Hard to believe that such a little thing managed to blind Thornfield. "Don't be fooled by appearances," Whitmore replied. "This one is poisonous as a snake. But today we're going to extract all the poison from her." They released Judith from the chains, but immediately shackled her with heavy irons that connected her wrists to her ankles, forcing her to walk hunched over. The walk to the plantation's central courtyard was slow and painful, each step sending waves of pain through her already battered body. The courtyard had been transformed into a kind of improvised arena. All the plantation's slaves had been forced to gather in a semicircle, their faces showing a mixture of fear, admiration, and anticipated horror. Judith searched for Rose among the crowd and found her near the front, tears silently streaming down her young face. In the center of the courtyard, a wooden structure had been erected, a tall post with hanging chains, clearly built specifically for this occasion. Near it, a table displayed a variety of instruments that made Judith's stomach contract. whips, branding irons, knives, and other implements of torture. "Listen well, all of you!" shouted Whitmore, his voice echoing through the silent courtyard. "This woman committed an unforgivable crime. She attacked a white man, a representative of authority on this plantation. Such an act of rebellion cannot and will not be tolerated." He gestured for Judith to be taken to the post. While the overseers chained her to the wooden structure, she kept her eyes fixed on Rose, trying to transmit strength and love through her gaze. Her younger sister looked so fragile and frightened that Judith felt her heart break. "The punishment for such a crime," Whitmore continued, "is death. But a quick death would be too merciful. This negress needs to serve as an example to all of you about what happens when you forget your place." One of the visitors approached the table of instruments and picked up a particularly cruel whip with multiple leather strips interwoven with small pieces of metal. "May I have the honor of the first lesson?" he asked, smiling with sadistic anticipation. "Certainly," Whitmore replied. "But remember, we want her to last as long as possible. The lesson needs to be complete." Judith closed her eyes and prepared for the pain that was to come. But before the first blow could be struck, a familiar voice echoed through the courtyard. "Stop!" Everyone turned to see Martha walking toward the center of the courtyard, her posture erect and determined despite her advanced age. Murmurs of surprise spread among the gathered slaves. It was unheard of for someone to interrupt a punishment ordered by the master. "Get back to your place, old woman," Jenkins growled, moving to intercept her. "This is none of your business." "It is my business," Martha replied, her voice loaded with an authority that surprised everyone. "Because I have something that Master Whitmore needs to know before continuing with this execution." Whitmore frowned, clearly irritated by the interruption. "What could you possibly have to say that would be relevant here?" Martha approached closer, her eyes fixed on Whitmore with an intensity that made the planter step back slightly. "I know about the books, Master Whitmore." "The books you keep hidden in your office." Whitmore's face paled instantly. "What are you talking about, old woman?" "I'm talking about the real plantation records," said Martha, her voice gaining strength. "The ones that show how much money you've been embezzling from the profits that should go to your partners in Louisville. I'm talking about the cotton sales you record as losses, but which are actually sold at high prices on the black market." A deadly silence fell over the courtyard. The visitors from other plantations exchanged significant looks. Financial corruption was a crime that even other planters wouldn't tolerate, especially if it involved cheating business partners. "You're delirious," said Whitmore, but his voice had lost its previous confidence. "An old slave woman wouldn't know anything about account books." Martha smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Ah, but I can read, Master Whitmore. I learned when I was young, before being sold to this plantation. And during all these years cleaning your office, I saw many interesting things." Judith watched the scene unfold with a mixture of hope and terror. Martha was clearly risking her own life to save her, but she was also revealing a secret that could destroy Whitmore if he allowed her to live to tell it. "Even if that were true," said Whitmore, trying to regain control of the situation, "the word of a slave is worth nothing against that of a white man." "Maybe not," Martha agreed. "But what if I told you where to find the real books? What if I told you about the safe hidden behind the portrait of your late wife, where you keep the stolen money?" The man with the scar on his face approached Whitmore, his expression now serious and calculating. "Whitmore, if there's any truth to this—" "There isn't!" shouted Whitmore, but the desperation in his voice was evident. "She's lying to save the life of this criminal." "Then you wouldn't mind if we took a look at your office?" asked another visitor, a corpulent man with small and shrewd eyes. "Just to clear things up." Whitmore looked around the courtyard, realizing he had lost control of the situation. His own overseers watched him with doubtful expressions, and the gathered slaves seemed to be holding their breath, sensing that something fundamental was changing. "Very well. he said finally, trying to sound confident. Let's go to the office. But when you find nothing, this old woman is going to join the other one at the post. While the group headed to the big house, Martha approached Judith. Be strong, child, she whispered. This isn't over yet. Martha, Judith whispered back, even if you're right about the books, that won't save me. I still attacked Thornfield. Maybe, Martha replied, but sometimes one truth can lead to other truths. And sometimes, when powerful people start to fall, they take others with them. Judith didn't fully understand what Martha meant, but there was something in the older woman's expression that gave her hope. Martha had survived decades of slavery through intelligence and careful observation. If she was risking everything at this moment, she must have a very good reason. About an hour later, the group returned to the courtyard, and the expression on Whitmore's face said everything. He walked like a defeated man, his shoulders hunched and his face pale as paper. The visitors followed him with somber expressions, and Jenkins looked confused and nervous. Well, said the man with the scar, addressing the gathered slaves, it seems the old woman was right. We found not only the falsified books, but also a considerable amount of money that clearly doesn't belong to Master Whitmore. A murmur spread among the slaves, a mixture of surprise and something that could be hope. Judith felt her heart accelerate. Maybe Martha had managed to save her life, at least temporarily. But that doesn't change the fact, the visitor continued, that this woman attacked a white man. Such a crime still demands punishment. The hope that had begun to grow in Judith's chest quickly faded. Martha had exposed Whitmore, but it wasn't enough to save her completely. It was then that Martha stepped forward again. There's one more thing you need to know, she said, her voice loaded with iron determination, about why Judith attacked Thornfield. That's irrelevant, said Whitmore quickly, trying to regain some control. The motive doesn't matter. The crime was committed. Oh, but it does matter, Martha replied, especially when the motive involves the systematic rape of slave women by Thornfield, with the knowledge and approval of Master Whitmore. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to stop blowing. The visitors exchanged uncomfortable looks. Although sexual violence against slave women was common and rarely punished, it was considered bad taste to discuss it openly, especially in front of other respectable planters. That's a lie, shouted Whitmore, but his voice sounded desperate. This old woman is making up stories to save her friend. Then explain this, said Martha, taking something from inside her dress. It was a piece of yellowed paper, clearly a letter that Thornfield wrote to a friend in Louisville, describing in detail his activities with the women of this plantation, a letter he lost during one of his drinking binges and which I found. The corpulent man took the letter and read it quickly, his face becoming increasingly somber. He passed the letter to the man with the scar, who also read it with an expression of growing disgust. My God, Whitmore, murmured the man with the scar, this is pure depravity, and he mentions that you knew everything, that you even suggested which women he should visit. Whitmore tried to grab the letter, but the visitor pulled it away. That's forged. That old witch forged that letter. The handwriting seems genuine, said the corpulent man, and the details are too specific to be invented. Judith watched the scene unfold with a mixture of hope and terror. Martha had clearly planned this carefully, gathering evidence against Whitmore and Thornfield over the years. But Judith knew that even with all these revelations, her situation was still precarious. It was then that Rose stepped forward from the crowd of slaves. The 15-year-old girl walked with trembling but determined steps, her tears dried and replaced by an expression of courage that very much reminded one of her older sister. It's true, said Rose, her young but clear voice. Everything Martha said is true. Thornfield, he came to me last week, said it was my turn. Judith saved me. She protected me. Rose's confession was like a bomb exploding in the silent courtyard. Several other slaves began to speak up, telling their own stories of abuse and violence. Women who had remained silent for years finally found courage to speak, inspired by Judith's example and the unexpected protection that Whitmore's exposure had provided. The visitors listened to the stories with increasingly somber expressions. Although violence against slaves was accepted, there were unwritten limits about what was considered acceptable, even by the brutal standards of the time. What was being described went beyond normal cruelty and entered the territory of total depravity. "Whitmore," said the man with the scar finally, "you turned this plantation into a brothel of horrors. This isn't just morally repugnant, it's bad for business. Traumatized and injured slaves don't work well. And the stolen money," added the corpulent man, "makes us accomplices if we don't act. Our own businesses could be questioned by association." Whitmore looked around desperately, realizing he had completely lost control of the situation. His own overseers watched him with hostile expressions. They too had been deceived about the plantation's true profits, and now understood they had been deprived of their legitimate bonuses. "What are you suggesting?" asked Whitmore, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're suggesting," said the man with the scar, "that you're no longer in a position to manage this property. We're suggesting that alternative arrangements need to be made." Judith felt a wave of shock run through her body. Were they talking about removing Whitmore from the plantation? This was almost unheard of. Planters rarely interfered in each other's business, no matter how questionable the methods. "And what about her?" asked Jenkins, pointing to Judith. "She still attacked Thornfield. That can't go unpunished." The man with the scar looked at Judith for a long moment, his calculating eyes weighing options. "Considering the circumstances," he said finally, "and considering that she was defending her sister from imminent rape, I'd say justice has already been done. Thornfield paid the price for his crimes." "But the law," Jenkins began. "The law," interrupted the corpulent man, "is what we say it is. And we say this woman acted in legitimate defense of her family. Case closed." Judith could barely believe what she was hearing. Were they really freeing her? After everything that had happened, after being certain she would die that day, she was being spared. Martha approached her and began loosening the chains that bound her to the post. "I told you that sometimes miracles happen," she whispered with a smile. "How did you know?" asked Judith, still stunned. "How did you know about the books, about the letter?" "Child," Martha replied, "when you're invisible to people long enough, you see and hear many things. I've been keeping this information for years, waiting for the right moment to use it." "And why now? Why did you risk everything for me?" Martha stopped working on the chains and looked directly into Judith's eyes. "Because you showed me it was possible to fight. Because you reminded me that we're human, not animals. And because," her voice became softer, "you reminded me of my own daughter, who died defending her honor many years ago." The chains finally came loose, and Judith fell to her knees, her legs trembling too much to support her. Rose ran to her, and the two sisters embraced in the middle of the courtyard, their tears mixing as the reality of their salvation began to settle in. But even while celebrating her unexpected freedom, Judith knew this was only the beginning. Whitmore had been exposed and removed, but the institution of slavery remained. Other Thornfields and other Whitmores existed on plantations throughout the South. Her victory was significant but limited. Still, as she looked around the courtyard and saw the faces of the other slaves, faces that now showed something she hadn't seen in years, hope. Judith knew she had planted a seed. A seed of resistance, of dignity, of possibility. Judith's story was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. 3 weeks had passed since the day that changed everything on the Whitmore plantation. The former master had been escorted off the property by the visitors from Louisville, taking only the clothes on his back and the shame of his public exposure. Temporary administration of the plantation had been handed over to a man named Thomas Hartwell, a younger planter with a reputation for being, by the standards of the time, relatively humane in his treatment of slaves. Judith walked through the cotton fields in the late afternoon, observing the other workers. There was a palpable difference in the air. People walked with more dignity, spoke in slightly louder voices, and there was a gleam in their eyes that hadn't existed before. Her action had unleashed something much bigger than she had imagined, an awakening of collective consciousness among the enslaved. "Judith!" Rose's voice called her from the quarters. Her younger sister was running toward her, holding something in her hands. "Martha wants to talk to you. She said it's important." Judith followed Rose to Martha's cabin, which had become a kind of informal meeting center since the recent events. When they entered, they found not only Martha, but also Samuel's brother Jacob, a strong 30-year-old man who worked as a carpenter, and Sarah, a middle-aged woman who served as midwife for the slave community. "Sit down, child," said Martha, gesturing to an improvised bench made of wood. "We have important things to discuss." Judith sat down, feeling the tension in the air. There was something different in Martha's expression, an urgency she hadn't seen before. "What's happening?" asked Judith. Jacob leaned forward, his voice low but intense. "We've been receiving messages," he said. "Messages from other plantations. Your story has spread, Judith. People are talking about the woman who blinded the overseer and lived to tell the story. And it's not just talk," added Sarah. "There have been 3 escape attempts on neighboring plantations in the last week. One of them was successful." Judith felt a mixture of pride and terror. "That's wonderful, but also dangerous. If the authorities start connecting these escapes to my action—" "They already have," said Martha gravely. "That's why we need to talk. There are people looking for you, Judith. People who want to use your story for something bigger." "What kind of people?" Jacob looked around nervously before answering. "People from the Underground Railroad. They heard about you and want to meet." Judith's heart accelerated. The Underground Railroad was more than just rumors. It was real, and they knew about her. "When?" she asked. "Tonight," Martha replied. "There's a secret meeting at the old abandoned chapel in the forest." "But Judith," her voice became serious, "you need to understand that if you go to this meeting, there's no going back. You'll be committing to something much bigger and more dangerous than anything you've ever done." Judith thought for a moment, weighing her options. She had found relative safety on the plantation under the new administration, but she knew this was temporary. Sooner or later, the authorities would come after her, and even if they didn't come, she couldn't simply return to normal life knowing that others still suffered as she had suffered. "I'll go," she said finally, "but what about you and Rose?" "Rose will stay with us," said Sarah firmly. "We'll protect her. As for us, well, maybe it's time some of us also considered our options." When night fell, Judith silently made her way to the forest that surrounded the plantation. The old chapel had been built decades ago by an itinerant preacher, but had been abandoned when the local congregation built a larger church in town. Now it was just a ruined wooden structure, half hidden among the trees. Judith approached carefully, all her senses alert for possible traps. But when she reached the chapel, she found only 2 figures waiting for her, a middle-aged white woman with graying hair and kind eyes, and a tall, thin black man she didn't recognize. "You must be Judith," said the woman, extending her hand. "My name is Elizabeth Morrison. I'm a friend of people who need help." Judith shook the offered hand, noticing that the woman's skin was soft and well cared for, clearly someone of elevated social position. "And I'm Marcus," said the black man. "I'm a free man from Ohio, but I was born a slave here in Kentucky. I came specifically to meet you." "Why?" asked Judith, still cautious. Elizabeth and Marcus exchanged looks before Elizabeth answered. "Because your story has become something powerful, Judith. It's inspiring people throughout the South, but more importantly, it's showing that resistance is possible. We represent a network of people," Marcus continued, "people who believe that slavery must end. Some are escaped slaves like me, others are free people who risk their lives to help others find freedom. The Underground Railroad, Judith murmured. Yes, Elizabeth confirmed. And we want you to join us, not just as someone who needs help to escape, but as someone who can help others. Judith sat on a broken bench inside the chapel, trying to process what she was hearing. How could I help? I'm just a runaway slave. You're much more than that, said Marcus, sitting beside her. You're a symbol. Your story proves that it's possible to fight against oppression and win. That's powerful, Judith. That can change hearts and minds. But what exactly are you asking? Elizabeth approached, her expression serious but gentle. We're asking you to come with us to the north, to tell your story to people who can make a difference, abolitionists, politicians, writers, to become a voice for those who cannot speak for themselves. And Rose? Judith asked immediately. Rose can come with us too, said Marcus. We can get her off the plantation next week. But Judith, you need to understand, if you do this, you can never come back. You'll become a wanted fugitive throughout the South. Judith closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the decision before her. Leaving meant abandoning everything she knew, everyone she loved besides Rose. It meant living as a fugitive, always looking over her shoulder. But staying meant accepting a system that had almost destroyed her soul. There's something else, said Elizabeth softly. Something you need to know before you decide. What? Thornfield died yesterday, said Marcus. The infections from his burns spread. He spent his last weeks blind and in agony. Judith felt a complex mixture of emotions, relief, dark satisfaction, and strangely, a bit of pity. Thornfield had been a monster, but he had also been a product of the system that had created them both. This means, Elizabeth continued, that there's no longer anyone who can directly identify you as his attacker. Your chances of escaping safely are better now. And if I say no, asked Judith, if I choose to stay, then we'll respect your decision, said Marcus. But Judith, you need to understand that your action unleashed something that can't be stopped. Resistance is growing. Other people are following your example. If you stay, eventually you'll be caught in the middle of it, whether you want to or not. Judith stood and walked to the broken window of the chapel, looking out at the dark forest. Somewhere beyond those trees was the plantation where she had been born, where she had suffered, where she had found her strength. But also beyond those trees was a larger world, a world where perhaps she could make a real difference. If I go, she said finally, if I tell my story in the north, will it really change anything? We can't promise it will change everything, Elizabeth replied honestly. But we can promise that your voice will be heard, that your story will inspire others, that you won't have suffered in vain. Judith thought of Samuel, who had died without ever knowing freedom. She thought of her mother, who had given her life trying to protect her. She thought of all the women who had suffered at the hands of Thornfield and men like him. When would we leave? She asked. Tomorrow night, said Marcus. There's a window of opportunity. A storm is coming, which will give us cover. And there's a boat waiting on the Ohio River. And Rose. We'll get her off the plantation tomorrow during the day, said Elizabeth. There are ways to make it seem natural. Maybe she's sick and needs medical care in town. Judith closed her eyes and made her decision. When she opened them again, there was iron determination in her gaze. I'll go, she said, but not just for me. I'll go for all those who can't go. I'll go so their stories are told too. Marcus smiled, and Elizabeth took her hand. Then welcome to the Underground Railroad, Judith. Your real journey is just beginning. As she walked back to the plantation that night, Judith looked one last time at the fields where she had worked, at the quarters where she had lived, at the kitchen where she had changed the course of her life. Tomorrow, all of this would be just memory. But she wasn't running away. She was moving forward. She was taking her story, her strength, her resistance to a bigger stage. She was becoming something that Thornfield and Whitmore could never have imagined. A free woman with a voice that would be heard. The slave Judith was about to die. In her place, something new would be born. A warrior for freedom, a storyteller, a force of change that would echo through the years. Her true battle was just beginning. The storm arrived exactly as Marcus had predicted, bringing with it strong winds and torrential rain that masked any sound of movement in the darkness. Judith was crouched at the edge of the forest, watching the Whitmore plantation one last time. Beside her, Rose trembled, not just from the cold, but from the magnitude of what they were about to do. "Are you sure about this?" Rose whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of rain. "Can we really trust these people?" Judith took her sister's hand, feeling how cold and trembling it was. "We have no choice, Rose. If we stay, eventually something terrible will happen. At least this way we have a chance at real freedom." Elizabeth Morrison emerged from the shadows, wrapped in a dark cloak that protected her from the rain. "It's time," she said simply. "The boat is waiting, but we can't be late." The three women moved silently through the forest, following a trail that only Elizabeth seemed to know. The rain had turned the ground to mud, making each step treacherous, but also muffling any sound they might make. Judith carried only a small bundle with some personal possessions. A wooden doll that Samuel had made for her when she was a child, a faded photo of her mother, and the small bottle of laudanum that Martha had given her, now empty but kept as a memento. After an hour of difficult walking, they reached a clearing where Marcus waited with 2 horses. "From here we ride," he said. "It's faster and the rain will cover our tracks." Judith had never ridden a horse before, but Marcus helped her mount, placing Rose behind her. Elizabeth mounted the second horse with the ease of someone accustomed to riding. "Hold on tight," said Marcus, mounting behind Elizabeth. "We're going to ride hard to the river." The ride through the stormy night was an experience Judith would never forget. The wind whipped her face, the rain soaked her to the bone, and the constant movement of the horse made her muscles ache. But there was something liberating about the speed, the sensation of moving quickly away from everything she had known toward an uncertain but possibility-filled future. When they finally reached the Ohio River, Judith could see a small steamboat anchored near the shore, its faint lights barely visible through the rain. A tall, bearded man waited for them at the improvised dock, urgently gesturing for them to hurry. "That's Captain Williams," Elizabeth explained as they dismounted. "He's been transporting people to freedom for more than 10 years. The captain helped them board the boat, his movements efficient and professional. "Welcome aboard," he said, his voice warm despite the urgency of the situation. "You'll stay in the hold during the crossing. It's not comfortable, but it's safe." The boat's hold was small and dark, with only a few blankets for comfort. But for Judith, who had spent her entire life sleeping in overcrowded cabins and on dirt floors, it seemed luxurious. More importantly, it was the first space she occupied as a free person. "How long until we reach Ohio?" asked Rose, still nervous. "About 6 hours," Marcus replied. "When the sun rises, you'll be on free soil." As the boat began moving upriver, Judith felt a mixture of overwhelming emotions. Relief at having escaped, terror of the unknown that awaited them, sadness at leaving behind people like Martha and Jacob, and an iron determination to make her freedom mean something. "Judith," said Elizabeth softly, "there's something I need to tell you about what awaits us." "What?" "When we reach Cincinnati, you're going to meet some very important people. Writers, politicians, abolitionist leaders. They want to hear your story, but they also want you to tell it publicly." "Publicly?" "At meetings, in churches, maybe even at political conventions. Your story has the power to change minds, Judith. But that means you can never hide again. You'll become a public figure." Judith considered this for a moment. "And if I don't want to? What if I just want to live in peace with Rose?" "Then that's your choice," said Marcus. "No one will force you to do anything. But think about it. How many people are still suffering as you suffered? How many women are still being abused by men like Thornfield? Your voice could be the difference between life and death for them." Rose took Judith's hand in the darkness. "I support whatever decision you make," she said. "But Judith, you've always been brave. Maybe it's time to use that courage to help others." When the sun finally rose, painting the sky in golden and rosy tones, Judith was on the boat's deck, watching the shores of the Ohio River approach. Marcus joined her, pointing to a city that stretched along the northern bank. "Cincinnati," he said. "Free city, your new home." Judith breathed deeply, feeling the air of freedom fill her lungs. "Marcus," she said, "I want to tell my story. I want the world to know what happened at the Whitmore plantation. I want them to know about Samuel, about my mother, about all the people who suffered and died." "Are you sure?" he asked. "It won't be easy. There will be people who try to discredit you, who will say you're lying." "Let them try," Judith replied, her voice loaded with the determination that had been forged in the fire of suffering and tempered by the strength of resistance. "I survived Thornfield. I survived Whitmore. I can survive anything they throw at me." 3 months later, Judith was standing on a stage in Boston before an audience of more than 1,000 people. She had told her story dozens of times in recent weeks, but still felt a chill in her stomach each time she began to speak. "My name is Judith," she began, her voice clear and strong, echoing through the silent hall. "And I was a slave on the Whitmore plantation in Kentucky. I'm here today to tell you about the day I blinded the overseer with hot oil and about why I had to do it." The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. Judith could see tears in many people's eyes, anger on others' faces. But mainly, she saw something that filled her with hope, determination. "I'm not here asking for your pity," she continued. "I'm here asking for your action. Because while you're sitting comfortably in this hall, there are thousands of people like me still suffering on plantations throughout the South. There are women being abused, children being separated from their families, men being worked to death." She paused, letting her words penetrate the audience's consciousness. "I was lucky. I found brave people who helped me escape. But what about those who don't have that luck? What about those who are still chained, still suffering? They depend on us, on all of us, to fight for their freedom." When she finished speaking, the ovation was deafening. People stood up, applauding and shouting their approval. But more important to Judith, she saw people heading to tables at the back of the hall, signing petitions, making donations to the abolitionist cause, committing to action. After the presentation, a young white woman approached her. "Miss Judith," she said, "my name is Sarah Grimke. I'm a writer and abolitionist. I'd like to write a book about your story." "Why?" asked Judith. "Because stories like yours have the power to change the world," Sarah replied. "Because when people read about your courage, about your resistance, they're inspired to find their own courage." Judith looked around the hall, seeing people still talking animatedly about what they had heard, still planning ways to help. "Then write," she said. "Write about Samuel, who died defending his dignity. Write about my mother, who gave her life to protect me. Write about Martha, who risked everything to save a young woman she loved like a daughter." "And about you?" asked Sarah. "What should I write about you?" Judith thought for a moment, remembering the frightened girl she had been in the Whitmore plantation kitchen, the woman who had found courage in her darkest moment, the free person she had become. "Write," she said finally, "that I was a slave who refused to remain a slave, that I found my strength when I needed it most, and that I used that strength not just to free myself, but to help free others." 5 years later, the book, The Slave Judith, a story of courage and resistance, had become one of the most influential abolitionist texts of the time. Judith's story had inspired countless people to join the fight against slavery, and she had become one of the most respected voices of the abolitionist movement. Judith now lived in a small house in Boston with Rose, who had become a teacher at a school for free black children. They had built a good life, a free life, but Judith never forgot where she had come from or why she was there. On a spring afternoon, she received a letter that made her cry. It was from Martha, who had managed to escape from the Whitmore plantation with the help of the network that Judith had helped strengthen. "My dear child," the letter said, "I'm writing from a free town in Canada. Jacob and Sarah are with me, and we're all well. The Whitmore plantation was sold after Hartwell decided he no longer wanted to be involved with slavery. Many of the slaves were sold to other plantations, but some managed to escape using the routes you helped establish. I want you to know that your courage that day in the kitchen changed more than just your life. It changed all our lives. You showed us that we were more than property, more than animals. You showed us that we were human, with the right to dignity and freedom. Your story continues to spread. I heard there's a play about you being performed in New York, and that politicians in Washington are citing your example in debates about slavery. You became exactly what I knew you could become, a force of change, a voice for the voiceless, a light in the darkness. With all my love and admiration, Martha." Judith carefully folded the letter and stored it in a special box where she kept her most precious memories. Then she went to the window and looked at the busy street outside, where people of all colors walked freely, where children played without fear, where freedom was more than just a dream. She thought of the long road she had traveled since that terrible and transformative day in the Whitmore plantation kitchen. She thought of all the people she had met, all the stories she had told, all the lives she had touched. Her journey had begun with an act of desperation, a young woman defending her dignity and her sisters, but it had transformed into something much bigger, a movement, a cause, a force of change that would continue far beyond her own life. Judith smiled, feeling a deep peace settle in her heart. She had found her voice, had used her strength, had transformed her suffering into power. And in the process, she had helped plant the seeds of a change that would one day bloom into freedom for all. The slave Judith had died that day in the kitchen. In her place had been born something infinitely more powerful, a free woman, a storyteller, a warrior for justice whose legacy would echo through the centuries. Her story had ended, but her influence would continue forever. And perhaps, she thought, that was the true victory, not just escaping slavery, but helping to destroy it so that others would never have to suffer as she had suffered. The sun was setting over Boston, painting the sky with golden and red colors. And somewhere in the south, Judith knew, other people were finding their own courage, inspired by her story, ready to fight for their own freedom. The resistance continued, the fight for justice continued. And Judith's story, the slave who refused to remain a slave, would continue to inspire future generations to never give up the fight for human dignity and freedom.